Okay, everyone, let's get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Pierce, and I'm the director of the Transnational Literature Series at Brookline Booksmith, just outside of Boston, Massachusetts, and your host for tonight's conversation. The Transnational Series focuses on stories of migration, the intersection of politics and literature, and works in translation. I just want to offer a quick Zoom webinar tutorial. At the bottom of the screen, you'll see a few icons. One of those is a Q&A icon where you can enter in your questions at any time during the conversation. Another button will lead to the chat window. That space is there for you all. Please feel free to chat during the event. I will be in the chat as well, dropping in useful information, including links to books by our authors. We do make every effort to keep these events free to attend in the hopes that you'll purchase the featured books from us. So thank you in advance for taking a look and supporting independent bookstores. And finally, you can see us, but we can't see you, so relax and please enjoy the conversation. Tonight I have the very great honor of introducing Elizabeth T. Gray Jr. and Chloe Garcia Roberts, here to discuss and celebrate the release of Let Us Believe in the Beginning of the Cold Season, selected poems of Forough Farrokhzad. Elizabeth T. Gray Jr. is a poet, translator, and corporate consultant. Let Us Believe in the Beginning of the Cold Season, her translation of modern Iranian poet Forugh Farrokhzad, was published in April 2022 by New Directions. Her own poetry collections include Salient and the Poetic Sequence series India. She serves on the boards of Kimbilio Fiction, Friends of Writers, the Beloit Poetry Journal Foundation, and Human Rights and Democracy in Iran. She holds a BA and JD from Harvard University and an MFA from Warren Wilson College. And tonight's moderator, Chloe Garcia Roberts, is a poet and translator from Spanish and Chinese. She is the author of a book of poetry, The Reveal, which was published as part of Noemi Press's Acrylica series for innovative Latino writing. Her translations include Li Xiangyin's Derangements of My Contemporaries Miscellaneous Notes, which was awarded a Penheim Translation Fund grant, and a collected poems of Li Xiangyin, published by the NYRB Poet Series. She is the recipient of a 2021 NEA Fellowship in Translation. I'm so thrilled to have them here together in conversation. And now Liz and Chloe.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Pierce. It's such an honor to be here virtually. There are a couple of serious indie bookstores around the country that are real beacons, and Brookline Booksmith is one of them. So thank you. I'm going to start with one of Forough Farrokhzad's most famous poems. Bear in mind, this was written by a woman in Iran in the early 1950s. Sin. I sinned a sin full of pleasure in an embrace that was warm and fiery. I sinned in arms that were hot and vindictive and made of iron. In that dark and silent sanctuary, I looked into his eyes full of secrets. My restless heart trembled in my chest at the demands of his hungry eyes. In that dark and silent sanctuary, I sat agitated at his side. His lips poured violent desire across my lips. I was freed from my mad heart's grief. I whispered words of love into his ear. I want you, oh my love, I want you. Oh, life-giving embrace, you, oh my mad lover. The passion in his eyes lit a flame. Red wine danced in the cup. In the soft bed, my euphoric body trembled on his chest. I sinned a sin full of pleasure beside a dazed and trembling body. Oh Lord, what do I know about what I did in that dark and silent sanctuary? Beautiful. That poem made her famous, not in an entirely good way. And it also blew up her marriage and lost her custody of her child.
That's beautiful. Thank you for reading that. It's been my honor to get to know Farrokhzad's poetry and your translations in preparing for this event. But I thought we could perhaps start with you telling us a little bit about her life as a woman. She is this figure whose art and whose life are very difficult to parse. She's a poet verging on an icon. But who was she, and can you contextualize a little bit her life for us before we start getting deep into it?
She was born to an army officer. She grew up in a suburb of Mazandaran of Tehran. They moved to the city when she was 5 or 6. They had sort of a middle class house. There was a, alleyway outside that, between all the walled houses that was very important to her when she was young. And she was a hellion. She was absolutely rebellious and never did what her parents told her to do. She was always getting in trouble. She was always passionate about poetry, and her father had an enormous library. He was unusual because all his 6 children had access to that library. He educated them well. 4 of them studied in Germany at universities, and both Farrokhzad and one of her sisters were members of the intelligentsia in Iran. When she was 16, she fell hard for a distant cousin of her mother's and insisted that she wanted to marry him. He was 11 or 12 years older than she was. And none of the families on any side thought this was a good idea. But she insisted, and they were probably concerned that she would do something bringing dishonor on the household. So the 2 of them got married, and she left with him to the town of Ahvaz on the Persian Gulf. It's a oil town, sort of like, Houston on the Persian Gulf. And it's very conservative. And she lived with him and his mother. And it was very dull compared to Tehran. She had a son, his name's Kamyar. She called him Kami, and she worshiped him. She kept writing poetry. Her husband supported that effort. She sent letters up. She sent submissions to journals in Tehran. She even went up to Tehran every now and then to meet with those editors. She started having an affair with one of them, and he sort of wrote an article about that. That was this poem, Sin. And that, as you can imagine, just sort of blew everything up, dishonored her family, her husband, his family. And so she sort of had to choose. And she chose to divorce her husband and abandon her son, Kami. And she moved to Tehran. Originally, she moved in with her family. They were horrified, and they checked her into a psychiatric clinic for 6 months. She got electroconvulsive shock therapy. When she got out, she went to Europe, spent some time in Rome and Germany with her brothers, and got very interested in some of the surrealist and modernist poets. She and one of her brothers translated some of that. So while she was well versed in Persian classics and liked very much the modern free verse poetry that was coming in Iran, she also had a background in some of the European writers of that time. She came back. She got herself an apartment in Tehran. She got herself a typing job at a film studio. She eventually got into directing film. She fell in love with and started having an affair with the producer, Ibrahim Golestan. She produced a short film, a documentary on a leper colony called The House is Black, which won awards all over Europe. I mean, this is a seriously brilliant, gifted woman. She and Ibrahim Golestan kept the relationship going until her death. She published a couple of books of poetry. Then her style really shifted when she came out with a book, Another Birth. It really was a rebirth of her as an artist. And she was basically a literary superstar. Scandalous, breaking all the rules. But really a forerunner literarily, as well as an iconoclast and feminist icon at a time when the Shah and his secret police were starting to shut down intellectuals and any kind of dissent in the country. This was mid 60s, late 60s. And at the age of 32, she was driving back from visiting her mother and got in a car accident and died. So this astonishing life took on yet another sort of tragic, the tragic loss of a young woman helped the myth. Her work continues to be vitally important to Iranians. Once the revolution occurred, her books were banned. She is not, every now and then, maybe there's a moment where you can read her, but basically it's illegal. You can't buy her work in Iran. She's immensely important to generations of Iranian women and men, and remains so. And because her work is it's rooted deeply in Iranian classical poetry and tradition, the imagery, some of the early forms, but fundamentally, her language is universal and her imagery is universal. And she's just gained an audience far across the world. She's by far the most famous woman poet Iran has ever produced.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was I've had the honor to kind of get to know her work through this book since you invited me to talk with you about it. It was a very beautiful review of the book in the New York Review of Books, where the reviewer had a line that I had felt really encapsulated something that I kept encountering through the poems, which is that the poems put an emphasis on freedom's ethical contradictions and costs. And it always, in so many of the poems, and the audience will have the pleasure of seeing that as you read more and more tonight, as you talk about her life and all these different facets, how she was dealing with the ethical contradictions and costs of freedom. It really comes home as you give that biography.
Yeah, she bought her artistic freedom at enormous cost.
Yeah. So before we get a little bit further into that, I always do love to hear the story of how the translator met the translated, and how did you come to this work, and how did you come to produce this book? And
well, initially I didn't know anything about her. Mm-hmm. I was a young hippie on the hippie road to Kathmandu, and when I got to Iran, I heard about these amazing poets that wrote ghazals that looked like they were kind of like sonnets, and I was into mysticism, so mystical poets that wrote these things to beloveds or to God was just exactly what I wanted to do. So I went back and studied and did that. So my introduction and I learned Persian to read Hafez. It is that simple. There's often a poet for whom you learn a language. And of course, people asked me about Farrokhzad, and I read some of her work. And yes, for her time, I said, this is unusual, right? It's rebellious, but the substance of it, I had an affair. It didn't seem as if the poetry itself was innovative. And so, many years went by. And I think in 2012 or 13, Stanford University's literary magazine, Mantis, asked me for a translation of something. They just said, hey, what do you have lying around? And I said, well, I've always been interested in this poem called Let Us Believe in the Beginning of the Cold Season, because what can that title possibly mean? I just didn't get it. And I had read translations and I just couldn't make any sense of it. So I thought either the poem doesn't make any sense or the translations are terrible. So I thought, I'll take that on. It took a year and a half. It's a really long poem and it's complicated. And I needed to check my work with people that are really good at Persian. And I just think it's a masterpiece of world literature. It was written close to the end of her life. It's surreal, it's bleak, but it's filled with all of the contradictions you were just talking about, Chloe. You know, the love filled with pain and transcendence, and whatever it is, the price is enormous.
Mhm.
So I was quite captivated. And when I was talking to New Directions and we were putting Salient in together, you know, Jeffrey Yang in New Directions said, look, we've been looking for 20 years for somebody to do a Farrokhzad. We've seen your stuff, give us a proposal and we'll check it out. So I thought, okay. And here we are. So I am deeply grateful to New Directions for this opportunity, because it let me encounter her work deeply and in a way I would not have otherwise. And I am the richer artist for it.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about that a little bit, because I noticed in the back of your book, in when you say your thanks, you thank your family for letting Farrokhzad into your pandemic pod. And to translate an author's work is a very intimate experience, but I can only imagine during the pandemic, it must have been even more intimate. You must have been even more of a focus on the work. So I am a little curious about how you're under, you know, how your relationship with her has developed into the now, since when you started the book.
Well, it was the perfect pandemic project. I would go to my writing studio and spend the day with her, and on Zoom with my colleague Rajan Var, who's a co-translator of mine. He was checking my work.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, it was such an odd time. It was nice to have the thread of that. So it was a year-long conversation with her. And I think at the end of it, I finally realized that I'm kind of tired of, actually, that's not what we're doing here, but I'm tired of people talking about her life and how amazing she was.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, many translators try and explain an ambiguity in her work. I think this woman, when she was on, was one of the most brilliant poets that ever walked and knew exactly what she was doing when she left a line ambiguous or truncated. And so I would guess my takeaway from that is that, well, I think her work is uneven. I think much of the late work is just brilliant. So it was quite an appreciation. And I learned a lot, because Persian operates differently, about, you know, why can't we do that in English? That's a conversation for another day we're going to have, right, Chloe?
Yes.
Chinese and Persian.
Yes, but I just can imagine if you're thinking about some of the imagery in her work of there's these walls, there's bars, there's this, you know, this feeling of being hemmed in constantly, and how much more resonance that must have taken on as you were translating it during the
during lockdown.
Yes, yeah.
A captive bird.
Mm-hmm. So I thought maybe you could give us some different kind of like a poetry tour of some different episodes of her life, or different things that she had gone through poetry, and read us a little bit of.
I'm happy to do that. I, you know, you and I talked about this. I've picked some poems that really come from different places in her life that we've talked about. One of the things that I didn't say was that in her early work, it's very much lover and beloved, as you saw in that poem, Sin.
Mm-hmm.
And as she matures, the work becomes more diverse. But she also sort of moves from thinking about a lover beloved and the feeling of love in its forms to a broadening out to look at the human condition and the politics of the time. It wasn't just women who were oppressed in Iran at the time. And so as her work matures, you see more of that. So there's a couple of poems in here that I think speak a bit to that time. This one I have always thought was sort of astonishing. You don't often hear about it. It's called Lost. And I believe that it was written when she left the psychiatric clinic. So here it is. Oh, after all those insanities, I don't believe I'm sane. It's as if she has died in me. I'm so exhausted and silent and erased. Dejected, every moment I ask the mirror, what is left of me? What do you see? But no, in the mirror, I see that I'm not even a shadow of what I was. Coquettishly, like that Hindu dancer, I stamp my foot, but on my grave. Look how with 100 regrets, I have lit up this ruin with my light. I do not seek the road to the city of day. Doubtless, I'm lying at the bottom of a grave. I have a jewel, but out of fear, I've hidden it in the heart of the swamps. I'm walking, but I do not ask myself, where is the road? Where is home? What is the goal? I give kisses, but I don't know who it is this mad heart worships. When she died in me, everything that was suddenly looked different to me, as if night with its two cold hands embraced my restless soul. Ah, yes, this is me, but what's the use? Now she who is in me is no longer. She is no longer. I roar madly under my breath. She who was in me, who was she? Who was she?
Gorgeous. I just, this line, look how with 100 regrets, I have lit up this ruin with my light. That's just wonderful, beautiful. More.
More. So the next one, I'm pretty sure, was written, she must have gone back to Ahwaz, to the house where she had been with her husband and son. And she must have gone back there to this dusty provincial town. And so she wrote this poem called The Return. At last, the ribbon of road ended. I arrived covered with dust. My gaze rushed ahead of me. On my lips, a warm hello. The town boiled in the pot of noon. The alleyway burned in the fever of the sun. Across the silent pavement, my feet moved forward, trembling. The houses had changed color. Dust-covered, dark, depressing. Faces encased in chadors, like ghosts in shackles. Like a blind eye, the dried up gutters were empty of water and any trace of him. A man passed by singing, my ears filled with his song. The familiar dome of the old mosque looked like a broken bowl. From the minaret, a believer chanted the call to prayer with a sad voice. Barefoot children ran after dogs, stones in hand. A woman laughed from behind her veil. The wind snapped a shutter shut. From the dark mouths of entryways came the damp scent of graves. A blind man tapping his cane passed by. An acquaintance approached him from a distance. A door opened silently there. Hands pulled me toward themselves. A tear rained down from the cloud of eyes. Hands pushed me away from themselves. Again, the old ivy on the face of the wall rippled like a trembling stream. The dense, thick leaves in ancient green, dulled by the dust of time. My gaze, searching, asked, where is there still a trace of him? But I saw that my little room was empty of his childish voice. Suddenly, from the heart of the mirror's cold soil, his image sprouted up like a flower. His velvet eyes washed over me. Ah, in his imagination, he saw me too. I leaned against the wall. Softly, I said, "Is this you, Kami?" But I saw that from that bitter past, nothing is left but a name. At last, the ribbon of road ended. I arrived covered with dust. The road did not lead the thirsty to the spring, and my town was the grave of my desires.
Kami is her son, correct?
Kami is her son, yeah. And I don't know, I find that one particularly heartbreaking. I don't think that, he was just told terrible things about his mother. I'm not sure they ever met again. I mean, it was really, just really a devastating loss for her. There's lots of talks about graves and darkness. I should say that Iranian poetry and Iranian culture is very much is very comfortable with death and martyrdom, and it's very embedded in Shiite Islam. And so you hear more about deaths and graves and dark things than you would in some other cultures. And I think it's this astonishing, contradiction. It's also the source of a lot of the Islamic philosophers of light. And certainly the poetry of tremendous transcendent love. So there are themes and imagery that runs through her work. We're not going to get to read it all tonight, so you may not see it all, but
that's interesting. Can I ask a question about that?
Yeah.
So I'm someone who she's often compared to, perhaps incorrectly, is Sylvia Plath, who has a very, has been put in this, is viewed as, she has a Gothic thread running through her work. So when you say that in Iranian poetry that this talk of graves is very common, so would you consider her work to be Gothic at all, or would you say that that's actually she's just using the
I'm not entirely sure I understand what Gothic means. It's not sort of macabre, the way Edgar Allan Poe and us is not.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I think it has a lot to do with Islam. I mean, on the day of resurrection, we're all coming out of our graves. Graves of holy people are a site of pilgrimage. I think in one of these poems I'm going to read, she talks some about the sterility of some of those shrines, but they're also places of pilgrimage. And so I don't think it's Gothic. And I think the analogies to Sylvia Plath tend to swirl around writing really charged verse, but the verse stems from being oppressed by a patriarchal relationship in Plath's case, and certainly a patriarchal culture in Iran. So there are analogies, but you don't really hear sort of the suicidal stuff you get with Plath or any of that. It's just in the culture. It's in the culture. Here is, how are we doing on time? We're doing fine.
Yeah. What are you going to read?
Well, I was going to read, this one is a famous poem of hers. It's called Wind Up Doll.
Yes. And
she is here mocking, the role of women in fancy modern Iran. And I guess in the selection I'm reading tonight, this is as close as you get to some of her sarcastic, mocking tone. There's a poem or two in the book, one called "O Jeweled Land," where you just are rolling on the floor because her mockery is so intense. This gets to that edge. Wind-up doll. Longer than this. Oh yes, one can remain silent longer than this. With a gaze fixed like the gaze of the dead, one can stare for long hours into the smoke of a cigarette, at the shape of a cup, at the colorless flower in the carpet, at the faint line of writing on the wall. With withered fingers, one can draw aside the curtain and look. In the alleyway, a heavy rain pours down. A child with his colorful balloons is standing in the doorway. A worn-out cart makes a racket as it hurries out of the empty square. One can remain in place by the side of the curtain, but blind, deaf. With a voice utterly false, utterly foreign, one can cry out, "I love you." In the overpowering arms of a man, one can be a beautiful and healthy female with a body like a leather tablecloth and two big firm breasts. In the bed of a drunk, a crazy man, a tramp, one can contaminate the chastity of a love. One can belittle with cleverness every wondrous riddle. Alone, one can do a crossword puzzle. Alone, one can amuse oneself with the discovery of a useless answer. A useless answer, yes, in 5 or 6 letters. One can kneel down for a lifetime with head bowed at the foot of a cold grill in a shrine. One can see God in an anonymous tomb. One can find faith with a worthless coin. One can rot in the chambers of a mosque like an old prayer reader. Like zero in subtraction, addition, and multiplication, one can always get the same result. One can imagine your eye in its implacable cocoon as a colorless button on a worn-out shoe. One can, like water in its hole, dry up. One can be just like mechanical dolls and see the world with 2 glass eyes. In a cloth-lined box with a body filled with straw, one can sleep for years in folds of lace and sequins. With every squeeze of a lecherous hand, one can spontaneously cry out, "I'm so very lucky."
Beautiful translation.
So we're gonna go down one more step into darkness, and then we're gonna come up with some of her really gorgeous, hope-filled poems. But this one I really find stunning because it could easily be written in Iran today. I mean, this is a country at the moment where on Saturday afternoons, families take their kids to the town square to watch hangings. So this, I think, is her darkest and most devastating condemnation of the Shah's regime. It was a time when Savak, the secret police, were arresting people and disappearing people and killing people. And it was just a very difficult time. So she's talking about political repression. She's talking about the loss of greenness and love and innocence and light. So it's pretty dark. I've actually eliminated a fair number of the verses because A, it's long, and B, there's only a limited amount of this stuff you can take. Earthly verses. Then the sun went cold and bounty left the lands. And the green of the fields dried up and the fish of the seas dried up. And after that, the soil rejected its dead. In all the pallid windows, night, like an uncertain image, kept crowding and rebelling, and in the darkness, the roads stopped going anywhere. No one thought about love anymore. No one thought about victory anymore. And no one thought about anything anymore. What bitter and black days. Bread had overcome the wondrous power of aspirations. The prophets, hungry and wrecked, fled from their trysts with God into the bewilderment of the fields. The lost lambs no longer heard the shepherd's call of, hey, hey. In the eyes of the mirrors, it seemed that movements and colors and images were reflected upside down, and above the heads of low-life clowns and the shameless faces of whores, a bright holy halo burned like a flaming parasol. The sun had died. The sun had died, and tomorrow, in the minds of children, had a vague, lost meaning. They portrayed the strangeness of this ancient word in their exercise books with a large black dot. People, the crowd of fallen people, discouraged and emaciated and dazed, burdened with their inauspicious corpses, went from exile to exile, and the painful desire for crime swelled in their hands. Always in the execution ceremony, when the noose's pressure squeezed the spasming eyes of the condemned out from his skull, they would be deeply moved, and their old and tired nerves twitched with lust. But always at the edges of the squares, you saw these petty criminals who stand and stare at the stubborn flowing of the fountains. And perhaps still behind crushed eyes, in the frozen depths, one half-alive, confused thing had remained in place, which in its powerless struggle wanted to believe in the purity of the water's song. Perhaps, but what endless emptiness. The sun had died and no one knew that the name of that sad pigeon who'd flown from every heart was faith. Oh, imprisoned voice, won't the splendor of your despair dig a tunnel out of this hateful night in any direction toward the light? Ah, oh, imprisoned voice, oh, last voice of voices.
Beautiful.
Well, I don't know about beautiful. It's a little grim.
Well, it's I mean, what I would love for you to tell us is how Farrokhzad, how she tells us that we can dig a tunnel out of this hateful night in any direction toward the light. Was there any answers in her poetry? Or
yes, I mean, I think that the birds, greenness, water, light, growth, all of those things. Let me read two shorter poems that I think speak to that, Chloe.
Mhm.
And then I actually found a segment of Farrokhzad reading her own work.
Okay.
And before we get to Let Us Believe in the Beginning of the Cold Season, a couple of selections from that, we can hear her speak her own poetry, which is kind of amazing. You can't do that with these 14th century guys.
Mhm. No, you can't.
Border walls. Now again in the silent night, barrier walls, border walls grow tall like plants, guardians of the fields of my love. Now what's interesting here, Chloe, is that what started as a cage, walls that were being built around her spirit, in this poem, they're now walls that are enclosing she and protecting she and her beloved. And it's a garden. The garden is what renews. Now again, the filthy hubbub of the city, like an agitated school of fish, decamps from the darkness of my shore. Now again, the windows find themselves pleasured by the touch of diffused scents. Now all the trees asleep in the garden slip out of their bark, and through thousands of pores, the soil inhales the dizzy particles of the moon. Now come closer. I sense, I know the moment of prayer, which moment it is. Now all the stars are making love with each other. Protected by the night, I drift from the end of all that is breeze. Protected by the night, with my heavy hair, I cascade madly into your hands, and I make a gift to you of equatorial flowers from this young green tropical land. Come with me to that star that for thousands of millennia lies far from the frozen soil and empty scales of the earth, and no one there is afraid of light. Come back to me, to the beginning of the body, to the fragrant center of a sperm, to the moment that I was created from you. Come back to me. I've remained incomplete because of you. Now the pigeons take wing above the peaks of my breasts. Now inside the cocoon of my lips, butterfly kisses contemplate flight. Now the prayer niche of my flesh is ready for love's worship. Come back to me. I have no words because I love you. Because I love you is a saying that comes from the world of futilities and worn out things and repeated things. Come back to me. I have no words. Protected by the night, let me become pregnant by the moon. Let me be filled by small drops of rain, by not yet developed hearts, by the form of unborn babies. Let me be filled. Maybe my love will be the cradle for another Jesus. So richness, greenness, birds, renewing spring.
Mm-hmm. Future.
Yeah, there's a future. There's a way out of this. This one, she looks back on her experience as a child. I think her childhood was very happy. Some of the poems, there's one called Those Days, which is a 7 or 8 page portrait of her childhood. I will greet the sun again. I will greet the sun again. I will greet the stream that flowed in me, the clouds that were my long thoughts, the painful growth of the aspens in the garden, who passed with me through the dry seasons. I will greet the flock of crows who brought me the scent of fields at night as a gift. I will greet my mother who lived in the mirror and was the reflection of my old age, and greet the earth again, whose throbbing interior with my chronic lust I have stuffed with green seeds. I will come with my glossy hair, rich with a sense of turned up soil, with my eyes, experiences of thick darkness, with bushes I have picked from the grove on the other side of the wall. I will come. And the threshold will be filled with love. And on the threshold, I will greet those who love again, and the girl still standing there on the love-filled threshold. So I think that we're gonna close with 2 things. One is some sections of her masterpiece, Let Us Believe in the Beginning of the Cold Season. And we're gonna play a recording of her reading the part of that poem. And then at the very end, we'll close with one of her most famous tiny little poems about birds. So Pierce, are you there? Do you want to run a minute or 2 of that video? There you are.
I'm here. Let's get this started.
When I found this a few days ago, I was so haunted. It's amazing to hear her voice.
Mm-hmm. Really
amazing.
It's a beautiful reading. Make sure I share the audio.
I'm impressed. You're quite a maestro on this, Pierce.
It's not my first rodeo. Okay. So can you all see my screen?
Yeah.
Lovely.
و این منم زنی تنها در آستانه فصلی سرد، در ابتدای درک هستی آلوده زمین و یأس ساده و غمناک آسمان و ناتوانی این دست‌های سیمانی. زمان گذشت و ساعت 4 بار نواخت، 4 بار نواخت. امروز روز اول دی ماه است. من راز فصل ها را می دانم و حرف لحظه ها را می فهمم. نجات دهنده در گور خفته است و خاک پذیرنده اشارتی است به آرامش. زمان گذشت و ساعت 4 بار نواخت. در کوچه باد می آید، در کوچه باد می آید و من به جفتگیری گلها می اندیشم، به غنچه هایی با ساقهای لاغر کمخون و این زمان خسته مسلول و مردی از کنار درختان خیس می گذرد. مردی که رشته های آبی رگهایش مانند مارهای مرده از دو سوی گلوگاهش بالا خزیده اند و در شقیقه های منقلبش آن هجای خونین را تکرار می کنند. سلام، سلام. و من به جفتگیری گلها می اندیشم.
Can you hear me? Is the sound bad?
Mhm.
Let us believe in the beginning of the cold season. So I'm going to read the same thing you just heard, and then I'm going to read the end of it. And here I am, a woman alone, at the threshold of a cold season, about to understand the contaminated existence of the earth and the sky's simple and sad despair and the powerlessness of these concrete hands. Time passed, and the cuckoo clock struck four. Today is the winter solstice. I know the season's secret and understand each moment. The Savior lies in his tomb, and the soil, the inviting soil, suggests peace. Time passed, and the clock struck 4. In the street, the wind is blowing. And I'm thinking about the flowers mating, about buds on thin anemic legs, and this exhausted tubercular time. And a man is passing by the soaked trees, the man whose threads of blue veins, like dead snakes, have crawled up the two sides of his throat and repeat into his panic those bloody syllables, hello, hello. And I'm thinking about the flowers mating. At the threshold of a cold season, among the mirrors gathered in mourning, and the huddled experience is grieving and pale, and in this sunset pregnant by the knowledge of silence, how can one command that person passing by, patient, heavy, confused, to stop? How can one tell that man he's not alive, that he's never lived? In the street, the wind is blowing, and the isolated crows of solitude circle in the old gardens of apathy. And the ladder, how stubby it is. And this is the closing stanzas. Where do I come from? I said to my mother, it's over. I said, it happens before you know it. We must send our condolences to the newspaper. Hello, oh strange loneliness. I surrender the room to you because the dark clouds are always prophets bringing new purifying verses. And in the martyrdom of one candle is the illuminated secret that the last and longest lasting flame knows well. Let us believe in the beginning of the cold season. Let us believe in the ruined gardens of imagination, in the scythe hanging upside down and idle, and the incarcerated seeds. Look at how hard the snow is falling. Perhaps the truth was those two young hands that were buried under the continually falling snow. And next year, when spring makes love with the sky beyond the window, and in its body fountains of feathery green stalks bubble up, it will blossom, oh my love, oh my most unique love. Let us believe in the beginning of the cold season.
Do we have time for you to read that Adonis quote?
I can. I think we do. We have the poem after this is not quite haiku, but close.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Adonis, many of you may not know who he is. He's probably the preeminent Palestinian poet of our time. Sorry, Syrian. Farrokhzad wrote,
Yeah,
sorry, what?
I was going to say it seems particularly resonant today in the United States for you to read it. So.
It really does. He says, Farrokhzad wrote poetry on the horizon of working for a civil society in which men's freedom was not complete without women's freedom, and for a life in which the soul's freedom was not separate from the body's, individually, socially, culturally. Her poetry is a space that radiates aspiration and exaltation, a space ablaze with vitality, desire, and beauty. And I'm going to finish off here. Birds are symbols. They're all through Farrokhzad's poetry. And this poem is very small and very famous. Apparently it was the favorite poem of hers from the Empress of Iran. By the same token, apparently, I can't report firsthand, you often find this poem scratched into the walls of prisons in Iran. It's called The Bird is Mortal. I am depressed. I am depressed. I go out on the veranda and I run my fingers across the taut skin of the night. The lamps of connection have gone dark. The lamps of connection have gone dark. No one will introduce me to the sun. No one will take me to the sparrow's party. Remember its flight, because the bird is mortal. Thank you.
I think we have time for a few questions. Is that right, Pierce?
That's right. Let me know if you need any help.
All right, so I have a couple questions here. I'll start with Greg's question. I would love to know about the curation of this work. especially how you chose the specific poems for the collection. Thank you so much for sharing this beautiful work and for this thoughtful conversation.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate that. I wanted to, and New Directions wanted to, include a variety of her poetry throughout her writing life. In my view, and in the view of many, much of the early work is not of the same quality. I mean, here we are, we're all poets, right? You know, we get better, presumably. But I tried to pull the key poems from her early 2 books because they're so important to who she is. And the middle book, Ocean, Rebellion, is not usually anthologized. Professor Milani suggested a couple of poems from that. She suggested I look there. So I pulled some from there, which are not often translated. And then I pulled a lot from her book, Another Birth, which really she felt was a turning point in her work. And then all of her posthumous poems from Let Us Believe in the Beginning of the Cold Season. So originally, I sort of just wanted to do the poems I liked, and most of those were late. But I was persuaded that if this really was going to be, for a while, the selected poems of Farrokhzad that New Directions was looking for, then we really needed to make sure that there are some poems that she wrote while she was in Munich and in Rome. There are poems that she wrote when she was, you know, living in Ahvaz with her husband and kid. There were poems that she wrote when her life was blowing up in Tehran. And some of the later love poems are clearly to Golestan, and they reflect a lot of her film work. So that was how we curated it. Hope that's responsive.
There's another question here from Susan. She asks, in some aspects of her life and work, do you see a parallel with Mina Loy?
Oh, that's an interesting question.
Yes.
I hadn't thought about that, but I would say, yeah, songs to Johannes. A lot of that work, you know, I don't think she lines up much with HD, but I do. Yes, I'm going back to my Mina Loy. Excellent question.
Me too.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Okay, this was worth the price of admission.
Yeah. Bravo, Susan. I think that's all the questions that we have. Is that correct, Pierce? Yeah, I think so.
Yes, unless anyone wants to get one in quickly. We might have another minute. Maybe you could, for anyone who doesn't know Mina Loy's work, could you talk a little bit about that, Liz, and why you think it's a good parallel?
I am not a Mina Loy scholar, but she was a modernist. And like many of the early modernists that were hanging out in London around T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound in those times, there was some very innovative writing going on by women. And of course, it didn't get much play because they were women. Mina Loy's work is very spare, but she has this huge, long serial poem called Songs for Johannes, which is to a beloved. Johannes is her beloved, and it talks about sex and miscarriages and all. I mean, it's really embodied in a way that was quite unusual for writers at the time. And the way that she chisels her language and picks her imagery is quite something. And other than that, there's not much I can tell you, but her work, there's a selected or a collected. I actually, yeah, I think it's called The Lost Lunar Baedeker. Here it is. The Lost Lunar Baedeker poems. It's really stunning work. I think that they there are more people paying attention to her now. She has gained an audience in a way that she didn't have at the time. There are a bunch of lost modernists.
Mhm. I think that sounds like a kind of a more resonant and interesting parallel in the Sylvia Plath one.
Yes, I do too.
You have a couple questions that just came in.
All right.
If I have a moment to get to them. The first one is from Jim, and it says, do you aim in translating to find resemblances in phrasing and line length and stanza pacing?
The translator's questions.
Mm-hmm.
Farrokhzad's early work is in quatrains, and it's rhymed with very even meter. It's very classical Persian form. Her later work, her free verse, breaks with that. You know, on the scale of translators, I come down on the side of being more literal. I brought my first Hafez translations to Elizabeth Bishop, and she said, well, how did these line up with the original? I said, well, you know, I broke the couplets apart and I moved them around. This is what Iranians do. And she just looked at me and said, you think that you can rearrange the lines of the premier poet of the Islamic world? Who are you? And that was very useful. So I set me on my way to being a literalist. So to address your question, I have tried here not to so much replicate sound or phrasing, but to really replicate how she used line. Because the way Persian syntax is structured, you get these parallel phrases. I will come back, I will come back, I will come back. And they're hard to do in English. They're easy to do in Persian. And so if there were places that felt mysterious or broken, I tended to leave them that way. And instead of trying to connect things or let the line explain something, I tend not to. In her work, the stanzas and punctuation are all over the place, not because she's like that, but because there is no critical edition of her collected works. And nobody owns the rights. So there are different editions of hers everywhere. And some of them have stanzas broken in different places. And some of them have punctuation put in or not. And so translators have really had a field day. Because Persian doesn't have capital letters and Persian doesn't have gendered pronouns. So you can't tell whether it's he, she, or it. So I've tried to be very literal and hone in on what she actually said. I hope that's responsive.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. It's almost like the situation that you'd come across in a classical era translation. Okay, one last question from Diana. Can you talk about how you came to translation, Liz? How did you begin to feel comfortable translating work in a language you learned as an adult?
You just have to be determined. I mean, I literally learned this language because I wanted to read the gorgeous Persian script on Hafez's tomb. I stood there, there were pilgrims there from all over the Islamic world. The translation I bought sounded like bad Tennyson. And I literally learned Persian to do that. At the end of first year Persian, I went to my teacher and said, Wheeler, can I translate Hafez now? And he burst out laughing and rolled on the floor and said, yeah, let me find you a graduate student. So there's a lot of questions these days about who's entitled to translate what. Am I a 14th century elderly Islamic mystic? No, but the work so intrigued me as a poet and as a seeker that, you know, I just took years of it and went and studied in Iran and, you know, sat there with my piles of dictionaries, line by line, going through Hafez. And so do I speak it fluently? I do not. Can I read it fluently? I do not, but with enough time and all my past experience with the language, especially the classical language, I understand how it works. And so, yeah, I wasn't entitled to do this, but I just, as a poet, I wanted to study with Hafez. I mean, that's why I learned it. I learned my Hindi so I could schlep around India. But I learned Persian only for its poets.
I think that's all the questions.
Well, thank you, Pierce. Thank you, everybody, for having us. I'm just going to steal a look at the chat before it disappears to see who's here. Hi, everybody.
Thank you, everyone, so much for being here tonight. This has been incredible. Liz, I could listen to you read these poems for forever, practically. I won't even put time on it. I could just keep listening to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you to everyone for the comments in the chat. It has been an incredible conversation. And lovely. Thank you, everyone. We do have copies at the store. It's just released. It's a beautiful New Directions paperback original. I can't recommend it enough. The translator's note is phenomenal. That's one of my favorite parts of New Directions books is the translator notes. There's a lovely bibliography at the end, and there's other information about her. Thank you, Liz. This is such a contribution to literature for us, for anyone who cannot read the Persian.
Well, thank you for having us. This is an honor and a pleasure. Thanks, Chloe. This has been fun. And we should do this again sometime while we can talk about the translation piece.
Yes.
Absolutely.
All right, everybody. Thanks so much. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks,
and thank
Pierce.
you again, Chloe. And good night, everyone.